So the last chapter on attitudes is about attitude and behavior, right? If you remember in the beginning, much of the interest in attitudes is motivated by this kind of perceived strong association between the attitude people have and the behavior they perform. So if you really like a product, if you really like a party, if you have a very warm feeling towards another person, then you're more likely to act in that way. And that's why we're interested in attitudes. But is this actually true? And the answer, as you can see by the subtitle, is probably not, or at least not as much as you think. Here's a classic story and a classic study might be a little bit strong by Lapierre. He's a sociologist, but what he did in the 1930s is to travel around the country in the US with a Chinese couple. He himself is American, so they travel around in the US, and what they do is they visit certain restaurants all over the place. They go to restaurants and see, strangely for us to imagine today, but at that time quite common, they see if they're actually being served. So at that time in the US, there were a lot of anti-Chinese attitudes. People didn't like Chinese people, and American people didn't like Chinese people at that time very much. So he was wondering, well, there's this anti-Chinese sentiment attitude in our society. Does that actually translate to actual behavior? And what he finds is that basically only one restaurant of over 30 refused to serve the couple. Now, he did something else then. Later when he came home, he called all of these restaurants and asked them whether or not they would actually serve a Chinese couple. And here, I think like something more than 90% of the restaurants he visited, that basically all of them served them, but more or less all of them said, we would not serve a Chinese couple in our restaurant. Please do not come. So Lapierre, being a sociologist, you can say, okay, there's a lot of problems with that study. You could just imagine, for instance, starting on the back, right, you can think like maybe he called people who were different people than the people who actually worked in a restaurant. So he measured the attitudes of people who did not perform the behavior. You can also think that maybe if he would not have been there, if the Chinese couple would have gone alone into the restaurant, this would be very different. But in some ways, it's a fun story, and it's also it's kind of a fun story, right? And because people say, we don't like Chinese people, we would not serve Chinese people. But then in actuality, when it comes down to business, everyone is serving them. So here's like this disconnect between attitudes and behavior. And I think this is also kind of like a intuition about the surprising lack of the connection between attitude and behaviors. And there's a lot of suspicion in the psychological research community about the strength of the connection between attitudes and behavior. So we talked a little bit about this. There are many kind of meta-analysis. Here's a classic one, review articles, who looked at all the research and trying to figure out what is actually the relationship between attitudes and behavior. And there is a relationship between attitudes and behavior. It is, as always in psychology, far from perfect, but there is one. There's one stable. There's one important one. Hence, there's a kind of our prolonged interest in attitudes. But there are also certain conditions where the attitude-behavior link, the relationship, are stronger and certain are kind of weaker. I think we talked about this already, about this review here. Eisen and Fishbein, in a very famous review, kind of said like, okay, attitudes need to correspond to the behavior. The better the correspondence, the better the prediction for behavior. And we had that when we talked about measurements. But one way kind of that stimulated is to think more about this attitude behavior link. What conditions have to be met in order for a person to act on their attitude, and what stands in the way. So remember, Maisie, if you're in the beginning of our very first week, about kind of like why people do not talk when they commute to other commuters, even though it would make them happy. Why do they perform a certain behavior that kind of is detrimental through their own well-being? When we kind of had this very simplified way of thinking about it, which is that, there are certain theories people have. For instance, self-isolation makes me happier than talking to other people. This kind of translates and beliefs into attitudes. And this then leads them to behave in a certain way. And what kind of started with Fishman and Eisen's idea, and very much driven by both of them, was trying to say, like, okay, we need to have a more sophisticated understanding. What does it actually mean when we talk about beliefs and attitudes? So one of the most famous ideas that came of that is a group of theories which most often is called expectancy value theories, and value stands for attitudes. But the most famous of them is the theory of planned behavior, which tries to explain when people act according to their attitudes. So what do you see here on the right is the behavior. Uppsala. Let's first just look at what we see, and then we look at each component separately. So we want to predict this behavior, whether they do one thing or the other. And so in order to predict that behavior, Fishman and Eisen say you have to have a positive attitude to this behavior. You have to have a belief that the norms around, the social norms around you are favorably towards performing that behavior. And you have to feel like you can control this behavior. When these three are met, you kind of form an intention, and then this intention leads you to perform the behavior. That's the theory of planned behavior. There are many, many similar theories. All have in common at least this kind of attitude component, often called value, and this behavior control idea, which is often called expectations or expectancy. And most of them have also a norm component. It's one of the most powerful frameworks to explain behavior, and I think we will come back to that in the upcoming weeks, but it's really important to have a good understanding of that. Okay, so let's talk about attitudes. As we know now, it's not just this like one of three determinants for forming the behavioral intention. So, and there's a link between the attitudes and the intention. So when is this link stronger? When is it weaker? We had one, this was the correspondence principle here. If you did the Qualtrics link, you can see if you want to know whether you would come to the next live lecture, then I need to know your specific attitude towards that next upcoming live lecture. The more I generalize, do you like lectures in general, do you like attendance in general, do you have some kind of like, what's your attitude towards like your work ethic or your integrity, all of them, the further it gets away, the less able you will be to predict this behavior. But there's another one we talked about shortly. There was kind of like this relation between ambivalence. The more ambivalent you are about this behavior, maybe you think like, well, I like the live lectures, but the commute is really long and I really hate the commute. And then you kind of have a more ambivalent attitude towards attending the live lecture, and hence it will be less likely that your attitude forms the intention. Another one, there are three more factors that I just quickly want to talk about when the attitude is especially strong and thereby predict better behavior. One of them is self-interest. So if this is really good for you, if this is kind of like a behavior, if you form it has a really positive impact on your life, then you're more likely to have a very strong attitude towards it, and hence it will better predict behavior. The other one is if it's somehow related to your identity. A lot of things we do, we really care about, are not because we have some factual information about it, or we're some kind of like have a advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons list, and that at the end it came in favor out for the cons or the pros, and hence we have our attitude. Rather, what we have, it somehow defines us. It is important for us, and the more central a behavior becomes to our identity, the more strongly the like my attitude will dictate this behavior. So, for instance, you can see that often people like me who immigrate from one country to the other, when they leave their country, they kind of feel like that their nationality as part of their identity is slipping away, and then they become more, in my case, I would become more German than the Germans at home, and I try to preserve more of this tradition because I feel like it's important to do that in order to keep my attitude intact. The third one is information. So the more information you have, right, the more you know about it, the more sophisticated your understanding of a topic is, the stronger your attitude will be, because you have so much more information that supports yours. So this is also one reason why defending your attitudes is a real good way of increasing the attitude strength, because you have to come up with justifications and the reasons and research why you believe one thing over the other. So this is like, if you increase attitude strength, if you don't have an a non-ambivalent attitude, and if you have a strong correspondence between the attitude and the behavior, then the attitude will be a good predictor, at least of the intention, but then also of the behavior. Another one that we talk later on in another chapter, and not in another chapter, another episode in the upcoming weeks, is norms. So there are two different norms that we have, perceived norms, or two different types of perceived norms. One are more prescriptive, what we should do. The other ones are descriptive, what people are doing, right? And here we can just use our example. If you go onto the tube, you might feel like, oh man, I really want to talk to somebody. So you have a really positive attitude, but then you see that nobody talks. So the descriptive, and probably here also the prescriptive, the normative norm, says you should not talk, and hence you do not form the intention to talk. So norms, as we will see in later episodes of our social psychology module, have a very powerful impact on our behavior, even though we really want to perform something or not. You can imagine this, how the way you dress. Maybe you are a boy who always wanted to see how it feels like to wear a skirt, but you also feel that around you this would be perceived so negatively that you refrain from that. The third one is behavioral control. Most often this is called self-efficacy. So self-efficacy means that how strongly do you believe that you can perform that certain behavior. Sometimes there are kind of really rational, obvious reasons of why you might feel like I can't perform this behavior. For instance, you might feel like I really love the iPhone, and I really like the people around me love the iPhone. They would really much be happy if I buy the iPhone. So I have a strong positive attitude. I also have like the perceived norms are very in favor of buying an iPhone, but I just lack the money, so I have to go for a cheaper option on the Android market. So I don't have, this could be with donations, could be the same thing with many others. So sometimes we just don't feel like we can actually perform this behavior. This might be with studying, with performing a certain part of your coursework, etc. This will all kind of be, if you do not feel like you can perform behavior, you have the ability to perform it, then you will not form an intention. So this is another third really important component. And then, and this is, I just want to end it with that, there's also kind of like a gap between intention and behavior. Not always if we have the intention, we also perform the behavior. So if we're thinking like, oh, this afternoon I really strongly intend to eat an healthy snack, but then in the heat of the moment there's a donut, there's the apple, the donut is much more alluring, you're a little bit exhausted, and then what breaks down is your self-control. And this is here between the intention and the behavior. This is the realm of self-control. If you really want to do something and yet you fail to do that. So there are many reasons, as you can see, why people fail to act on their attitudes, right? Why people might not have this strong, even despite having strong attitudes, don't perform this behavior, because norms might be different, because behavioral control might be different. And they might not have the intention, or their self-control might let them down and they do not perform the behavior.